Beak in the Heart, I would describe it as a family memoir, and it recounts the life stories of several of my female ancestors, starting as early as the Civil War and then working up into the present. And these are women in South Carolina who didn't really fit in with the expectations of their society. They weren't always doing what they were supposed to do or living the way that their society expected them to live. So I try to tell their stories, but I also try to interweave some of my own experiences growing up in South Carolina and then up into my adulthood more recently, and use my female ancestors' experiences sort of as inspiration to help me better understand my own experiences. The title is The Beak in the Heart, True Tales of Misfit Southern Women. And the first part, The Beak in the Heart, is actually a reference to a line from Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. And in the poem, Poe is conversing with the raven that is kind of sitting on his doorway and reminding the speaker in the poem of his heartbreak. And one line in the poem, the speaker says, "Take thy beak from out my heart." And I think that the beak in the heart represents that pain of heartache, that pain of mourning or loss. And so that's where the title comes from. The beak in the heart is heartache, basically. It's mourning or loss, just painful, and that everybody experiences at some point in their lives. One of the things that inspired me to write the book and tell the story of these ancestors is stories that my parents would tell as I was growing up in kind of hushed voices and never quite complete stories that I would hear in little bits and pieces. My parents would, little bits and pieces of this experience would come out during conversations, but as a child, I never got the full picture. And for that reason, I became fascinated with them because there was something secret about them. And as I grew older, I learned more about these relatives, but I still had this fascination about them, and kind of their roles as outcasts always fascinated me because I saw in their experiences a little bit of myself in not quite fitting in, not quite feeling like I had the full acceptance of family and community at all times. One of my favorite relatives to write about was probably the one that I know the best, who was my great aunt Ella that I write about in The Cup. And she was the relative who gave birth to a child but was not married. And this was 1929 in South Carolina when her baby was born. So she was kind of a black sheep of the family. It was pretty scandalous. And when I knew her, she was just a very elderly woman. But I always knew that she had this secret past, which I found very intriguing. And my mother and father used to send me up to her house. She only lived about 2 blocks from where my parents lived. And they would, just have me do chores for her, sometimes as punishment. But, things like sweeping up or cleaning up in the house for her. If I were growing up in South Carolina today, I'm sure it would be different. And growing up anywhere today is different than it was when I was a child. But I don't really think that my experience growing up in South Carolina, 1970s and 1980s, was typical. And one of the reasons I say that is because for a lot of kids in the 1970s and 1980s, parents would kind of just let their kids have some freedom. There wasn't so much constant monitoring and surveillance of kids as there is today. And, often from the time school got out until dinner time, a lot of kids were just free out on their own doing whatever. And it was only when trouble arose that parents really checked in on them. But my parents weren't like that. They were very strict, very kind of controlling, and there was a lot of surveillance going on. One thing I hoped to accomplish by writing this book was just to give voice to these women from the past who really lived lives that were unremarkable in many ways and never got a chance to share their voice because they lacked opportunity. They were poor. They were not very well educated. But I think in their lives, there was still a lot of dignity. And they were, in some ways, very brave because they were going against tradition. And I think these earlier women who did things like that, go against tradition, and maybe suffered a lot because of it, they paved the way for people like me or people even in younger generations who have so much more opportunity and so many more freedoms than they did. And part of the reason we have these freedoms is because they bucked up against it. And it didn't go so well for them, but that breaking down of barriers happened gradually over time, and we are much better off because of it. Coming to a better understanding of my own mistakes, and the sense that through making mistakes and living through them and overcoming them, you can become a better person. And I think that there's some strength in that, in having lived through those experiences, having made those mistakes, and then understanding yourself better, understanding how you've evolved as a person. And that also can provide us the ability to be a more empathetic listener, a more empathetic helping hand to somebody else who might be also struggling through the obstacles that people struggle with through life. And it might provide you that opportunity to be able to reach out a hand and catch someone before they're falling into the same mistakes you've made in the past, or even if they've already fallen, to just reach out a hand and lift them up.